I arrived home earlier than expected from my business trip, choosing not to inform anyone of my return. Hey everyone! Great to have you back. I've got a fresh story for you today, so let's jump right in. My plan was simple. I wanted to surprise Daniel. But as I turned onto our street, something immediately felt off. A cluster of cars was parked outside our house, and the front yard was decorated with pink and blue balloons. A large banner stretched across the porch, welcoming what was being called our little miracle. My stomach twisted at the sight. Instead of pulling into the driveway, I parked a block away and walked toward the house. The front door was slightly open, allowing the sounds of music and laughter to spill into the evening air. Stepping inside, I felt my entire body freeze. In the center of the living room, Valerie, my best friend, stood with a rounded belly, unmistakably 6 months pregnant. My mother-in-law, Gloria, rested a hand on her stomach in an affectionate gesture, while my own mother played the perfect hostess, passing drinks to smiling guests. Nearby, a decorated table overflowed with neatly wrapped gifts. Across the room, an aunt inquired about the nursery, to which Valerie responded with enthusiasm, mentioning how Daniel had insisted on painting it himself, dedicating his weekends to making it perfect. And then, as if the universe had timed it cruelly, Daniel walked in carrying a tray of drinks. Without hesitation, he moved toward Valerie, wrapped his arms around her from behind, and placed his hands gently on her stomach. With an easy confidence, he spoke about how they had just picked out the crib together the previous week, as if the life they were building had been in motion for months. The sight was suffocating, a betrayal so overwhelming that for a moment, I couldn't move. Then, my mother saw me. Her expression shifted instantly from joy to panic, and she rushed to my side, gripping my arm and whispering urgently. She wanted to lead me outside, away from the celebration, away from the truth that was unraveling before me. But there was no avoiding it. I pulled away, the weight of reality crashing down. My presence had shattered the carefully maintained illusion in that room. Conversation stopped, glasses were set down, and eyes turned toward me, wide with shock. Valerie paled, her confidence melting into unease. Daniel stood frozen, his hands still on her belly, as if caught in a crime he could no longer deny. Silence settled over the gathering, but the tension in the air was deafening. My father, standing near the corner, couldn't even look at me. Valerie attempted to explain, stepping forward with hesitation, saying this was never how she intended for me to find out. But her words felt hollow, another well-constructed lie meant to soften the blow of an already unforgivable betrayal. Gloria interjected, shifting the focus to the baby, as if the situation should be handled delicately for the sake of Valerie's well-being. She spoke of stress, of concern for her condition, as if I was expected to quietly accept what had been done to me. The irony was sickening. Just 2 years ago, I had been in the same position, carrying a child that never made it into this world. Back then, there was no concern, no gentle voices urging people to be mindful of me. My mother made another attempt to calm me, speaking softly, trying to frame the situation as something to be managed, as if betrayal could be reasoned with. But her words only solidified what I already knew. This wasn't just Daniel's deception. It was a conspiracy, carefully maintained by the people I trusted most. Daniel finally moved away from Valerie, his voice quieter now, urging me to step outside with him, to discuss this in private, away from the crowd. He wanted me to keep my emotions in check, to preserve the illusion a little longer. But there was no more illusion. There was no conversation that could undo what had already been done. I could still remember the way he had convinced me to take that overseas job, promising that the money would help build our future. But now, it was clear that the only future he had been building was with someone else. The betrayal stretched beyond him. It reached Valerie, who had taken my absence and turned it into an opportunity. Whether they had planned this or not didn't matter. The damage was done. Valerie, now teary-eyed, tried to assure me that none of this had been intentional, but the words felt meaningless. Accidents didn't happen like this. A child wasn't created by mistake. This wasn't an impulsive moment, it was a choice. The unease in the room was growing. Some guests shifted uncomfortably, a few discreetly gathering their things, clearly eager to leave before the situation escalated further. My father finally spoke, his voice measured, asking me to calm down, to regain control. But I was calm. For the first time, I saw everything with perfect clarity. My husband, a liar. My best friend, a traitor. My family, a group of cowards who had chosen to protect this lie instead of me. Reaching toward the decorated table, I picked up one of the gifts at random, my fingers tightening around the ribbon. A quiet acceptance settled over me. There was no fixing this. There was only the truth, raw and undeniable. I picked up a gift from the table and turned it over in my hands. It was from my mother. A carefully chosen present for the child of the woman who had betrayed me. The weight of her silent approval crushed me, but I didn't let it show. Without hesitation, I tore the wrapping paper away. Inside was a delicate white baby outfit with blue details. Thoughtful, considerate. Almost as if this child had always been expected, always welcomed by everyone but me. Daniel moved forward, his expression darkening. He reached out, attempting to take the gift from my hands, his patience unraveling. He was done pretending. I was making a scene, embarrassing myself, shattering the carefully constructed illusion they had all lived in so comfortably. But I wasn't the fool here. He had done that all on his own, sneaking around, betraying me, building a life with my best friend while I worked tirelessly to support him. The disgusted scoff from across the room belonged to Gloria. She had finally reached her limit. To her, this was an overreaction, a public spectacle that was entirely unnecessary. She was quick to justify Daniel's choices, claiming he had only been searching for the happiness I failed to provide. I had been too busy, too distracted with work, always prioritizing something else. And she was right. I had been working to pay for the very house where her son had been sneaking around with my best friend. The realization settled heavily in my chest as I scanned the room. Every single person standing there, the ones I had once considered family, now looked like strangers. There wasn't a single familiar face left in that crowd. None of it mattered anymore. They could have it all, the house, the furniture, the gifts that had been so carefully chosen for a child that wasn't mine. But Daniel? He would need to figure out how to support himself because my money would no longer be an option. His expression shifted instantly. The color drained from his face as the weight of my words sank in. Panic flickered in his eyes as he stammered, trying to process what was happening. He hadn't expected this. He had assumed I would lash out, cry, scream, but not this. What he didn't realize was that while I had been overseas, I hadn't just been working. I had been preparing, consulting a lawyer, keeping records, tracking every single cent I had spent on this house, on him, on the life we were supposed to build together. Without another word, I turned and walked out. The air outside was thick, the weight of so many stairs pressing against my back. The neighbors had heard everything. The whispers, the pitying glances, it didn't matter. My hands trembled, my breathing was uneven, but I refused to fall apart in front of them. They didn't deserve to see me break. Reaching my car, I yanked the door open and slid inside, slamming it shut behind me. My fingers tightened around the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. My vision blurred, my mind raced, but the tears refused to fall. There was no room for them now. The engine roared to life, and I drove. No direction, no destination, just the need to get as far away as possible. My phone vibrated constantly, flooding with missed calls and unread messages. My mother, Daniel, even Valerie. Every notification carried the same desperate plea, an attempt to explain, to justify, to soften the reality they had so carefully hidden. Valerie insisted this wasn't how it was supposed to happen. She wanted me to understand. But I understood perfectly. While I was sacrificing everything to build a life for us, they were together. Every time Daniel called me, claiming he missed me, it had been a lie. Every time Valerie said she was too busy to talk, she had been busy with him. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a mistake. It was a deliberate betrayal, played out over months, right under my nose. A bitter taste coated my tongue. Disgust. Disgust at them. Disgust at myself for not seeing it sooner. At some point, I pulled into a hotel parking lot, barely registering the decision. I needed space. I needed air. I needed to be anywhere but that house, a house that had become nothing more than a monument to my humiliation. Walking up to the front desk, I barely acknowledged the receptionist's curious glance. My appearance was disheveled, my expression unreadable. Without a word, she slid a room key across the counter, sensing that now was not the time for questions. The moment I stepped inside, I locked the door behind me and let my body collapse onto the bed. The weight of everything hit me all at once, crushing, suffocating. I curled into myself, arms wrapped tightly around my own body, and let the tears finally come. Tears of rage. Tears of exhaustion. Tears of a pain so deep, it threatened to drown me. But I refused to let it. By morning, I knew what needed to be done. I walked into my lawyer's office, shoulders squared, jaw set. He had already been expecting me. The paperwork had been prepared, everything in order to ensure that I walked away from this with as little collateral damage as possible. There was no hesitation in my voice when I told him to start the process immediately. The divorce, the property division, and the certainty that Daniel wouldn't see a single cent of my money ever again. The lawyer assured me that I had nothing to worry about. The house was legally mine, every expense had been covered by me, and Daniel had no claim to anything. With more than enough evidence to back it up, there was no way he could take a single thing from me. A deep breath filled my lungs, and for the first time in what felt like forever, a sense of control settled over me. This time, Daniel wouldn't get to twist reality in his favor. Let him figure it out the hard way. Stepping out of the office, I felt lighter, as if a weight had finally been lifted from my chest. The endless loop of betrayal and anger had consumed me for so long, but now, there was something else, a quiet relief. My phone buzzed in my pocket. Daniel. I ignored the call. A few minutes later, a message appeared on the screen. Another desperate attempt. He wanted to talk. I had no interest in conversations that should have happened long ago. My response was short, final. I told him to talk to my lawyer. Days passed, and the calls and texts didn't stop. Apologies, excuses, empty words. I refused to respond. Then, one afternoon, as I sat at a small cafe near the hotel, sipping coffee and enjoying a rare moment of peace, a shadow fell across my table. Looking up, I found Daniel standing there. He looked terrible, deep bags under his eyes, hair unkempt, clothes wrinkled. But there was no sympathy left in me. Without waiting for permission, he slid into the chair across from me, desperation clinging to him like a second skin. His expression pleaded for understanding, but I had none left to give. He tried to explain, as if there was some version of this betrayal that could make it better. He never wanted me to find out that way. It hadn't been his plan. He claimed it was all a mistake, a moment of weakness that spiraled out of control. But this hadn't been an accident. It wasn't some unfortunate mishap. It was a series of choices, calculated, deliberate. He had chosen to sleep with Valerie. He had chosen to lie. He had chosen to let everyone around me keep me in the dark. His excuses followed, predictable and pitiful. He had been lonely. I had been gone too much, always working, always traveling. His voice carried a quiet resentment, as if his infidelity had been a consequence of my ambition. A bitter laugh rose in my throat. He wanted to blame my absence, as if he had been forced into betrayal. But I hadn't been traveling for fun. I had been working to support the very life he had been enjoying, paying the mortgage, covering the bills, providing stability while he did nothing. There was nothing left for him to say. The irony of it all hit me hard. I had taken that job overseas because I believed we were building something together. Every sacrifice I had made, every exhausting day and lonely night, had been for what I thought was our future. And while I had been pushing myself to the brink, Daniel had been at home, betraying me with my best friend. Now, he wanted to fix things. He wanted another way forward. But I had already made my decision. I met his gaze with unwavering certainty. The divorce was already in motion, the papers filed. He wouldn't see a single cent of my money, and as for the child he was expecting, that was his responsibility, not mine. Daniel's voice broke with another plea, but it didn't matter. This was over. I pushed my chair back, stood, and walked away without looking back. The fallout was inevitable. Word spread quickly. My real friends, the ones who had stood by me, who hadn't played a role in this betrayal, rallied around me. My family, however, wasn't so easy to cut off. My mother called repeatedly, her messages filled with guilt-laced justifications. They had never meant to hurt me. It had been complicated for everyone. I needed to understand. But I understood perfectly. They had chosen to protect Daniel and Valerie, to prioritize comfort over truth. And now, they expected forgiveness. Forgiveness wasn't an option. Instead, I moved forward. I left the hotel behind and bought myself a new apartment, one that belonged to me and me alone. I poured myself into my work, into my future. Slowly, the pain dulled, the memories became less suffocating. And Daniel? Without the security and comfort I had provided, reality hit him hard. A few weeks later, another message appeared on my phone. Another message lit up my phone screen. A desperate plea from Daniel. He missed me. He wanted to talk. I left. Then, without a second thought, I deleted it. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt completely free. When confirmation arrived that Daniel had been officially served with the divorce papers, I knew the real nightmare for him was just beginning. The calls increased, the messages flooded in, and he even started showing up at places he knew I frequented. His desperation was on full display, but I refused to give him what he wanted. There would be no conversation, no closure, no second chances. I had spent too long being manipulated, and I wasn't about to let him twist reality in his favor again. One evening, as I made my way back to my apartment, I spotted my mother waiting outside. The moment I saw her, I already knew exactly why she was there. She was worried about Daniel. He had lost everything, and in her eyes, I was the one responsible for his downfall. As if I had been the one to destroy his life, as if his suffering was somehow my fault. Hearing her frame him as the victim sent a fresh wave of disgust through me. Now, after everything, she expected me to show him kindness? To overlook what he had done? Anger burned inside me. He had made his choices, and now he had to live with them. While I had been breaking my back to support our home, our future, he had been betraying me in the worst way possible. And not just him, my so-called family had stood by and let it happen. And now, when he was facing the consequences of his own actions, I was the one being called cruel. She reached for my hand, but I stepped back, the last of my patience snapping. Her words, her guilt-laced reasoning, none of it mattered. Daniel's situation wasn't my concern. He had nowhere to go. That was his problem to solve, not mine. Her disappointment was clear, but so was mine. I had expected better from my husband, from my best friend, from my own mother. But expectations had only ever left me broken. Without another word, I turned and walked into my building, shutting the door on whatever last-ditch attempt she had to change my mind. As the days passed, Daniel's situation unraveled even further. The reality of his financial dependence on me hit hard. The mortgage payments went unpaid, the bills stacked up, and with no money of his own to cover anything, the inevitable came: eviction. I had been waiting for that moment. When the confirmation came through that he had failed to make the payments, I made sure to be there. This time, I wanted to see it with my own eyes. When I arrived, the chaos had already begun. Boxes were scattered across the front yard, half-packed belongings spilling onto the driveway. Daniel was in the middle of a heated argument with the officer handling the eviction, frustration and desperation written all over his face. Valerie stood nearby, one hand clutching her swollen belly, her expression a mixture of fear and disbelief. She looked lost, as if she couldn't quite grasp how things had come to this. Then Daniel spotted me. His voice rose above the commotion, filled with outrage, disbelief, like he had been personally wronged. But he had no ground to stand on. This house had never been his. It had been mine. Every mortgage payment, every bill, every ounce of stability he had taken for granted had come from me. He had been nothing more than a parasite, living in comfort while betraying the very person who had given him that life. His frustration boiled over, his demands growing more frantic, but I stood my ground. He wanted to know where he was supposed to go, how he was supposed to survive now that the safety net was gone. It wasn't my problem. Valerie turned to me next, her voice shaking, her eyes pleading. As if now, after everything, I was supposed to feel something for her. As if she deserved mercy. But all I saw was the woman who had whispered behind my back, hoping I would never uncover the truth. The weight of her betrayal still sat heavy in my chest, but there was no pain left, only satisfaction in watching her finally face the consequences. She muttered something about how this wasn't supposed to happen, but the words meant nothing. This was reality now, and they had no choice but to live in it. Daniel's hands dragged over his face, exhaustion written in every line. His voice was quieter now, thick with disbelief, as he accused me of having no heart. The irony wasn't lost on me. He had loved that heart when it was paying for his comfort, when it was giving and giving while he took and took. But now that he was left with nothing, he wanted to paint me as heartless. Before he could spew another excuse, the officer stepped forward, making it clear that time was up. There were no more arguments to be had. No more extensions, no more delays. The house was no longer his problem or mine. Panic flickered across Daniel's face as the reality of his situation fully sank in. He had no more leverage, no more power, no more safety. With one final act of frustration, he grabbed a box and slammed it to the ground. Daniel's frustration boiled over, his voice thick with anger and desperation. He wanted to believe I had done all of this just to destroy him. That I had orchestrated his downfall, pulled every string to make sure he suffered. He wasn't entirely wrong. Without hesitation, I met his gaze with unwavering certainty, offering him nothing but the cold, brutal truth. Yes! His jaw tightened, his fists clenching at his sides before he spun on his heel and stormed off. Valerie followed after him, her expression just as defeated. I stood there, unmoving, watching as they disappeared into nothing broke, homeless, powerless. In the days that followed, my family turned against me entirely. The phone call started. Aunts demanding to know why I had let things get this far. My mother knocking at my door, desperate to convince me to reconsider. Even my father, the one who usually stayed out of conflict, made his stance known. Daniel was sleeping on Gloria's couch. No home, no resources. My father's voice carried that familiar weight of disappointment, as if I was the one who had taken too much. As if I was the one being unreasonable. But I didn't see it that way. Valerie was pregnant, they had nothing, and yet, none of that changed the simple truth. Daniel had made his choices, and now he had to live with them. If he was struggling, it wasn't my burden to carry. For years, I had been the one providing, the one keeping things together while he lived comfortably off my hard work. Now, for the first time in his life, he had no choice but to stand on his own. Let him finally do what he should have done a long time ago. Get a job. My mother's frustration hit its peak, her patience gone. She was convinced I was obsessed with revenge. But she was the one who refused to see the truth. She had spent so much time protecting Daniel, excusing his actions, that she had no idea what accountability even looked like. Nothing they said could change my mind. And Daniel? He was in ruins. No home, no comfort, no access to the money he had leached off me for years. Word eventually got back to me through mutual friends. He had started taking odd jobs, struggling to make ends meet. It wasn't enough. It was never going to be enough. And then, just as I had expected, he showed up at my apartment. When I opened the door, I barely recognized him. He was thinner, the exhaustion clear in every line of his face. Dark circles hollowed out his eyes, his posture heavy with the weight of his downfall. He had nothing left. And he wanted my help. I stood in the doorway, arms crossed, meeting his pleading gaze with nothing but indifference. Because I knew exactly what this was. It wasn't regret. It wasn't love. It was survival. He tried to admit his mistakes, claimed he couldn't change the past, but wanted to fix things. But none of that mattered now. Because while I had been suffering, blindsided by betrayal, he had been lying to my face. While I had been working myself to exhaustion, he had been in my bed with my best friend. And now, when he was finally feeling the consequences of his own actions, he expected me to save him. But there was nothing left to save. He accused me of being cruel, as if I was the heartless one in this story. As if I hadn't learned cruelty from the best. Without another word, I slammed the door in his face. And for the first time in years, I felt at peace. Daniel was finally experiencing life without me, and I was finally free. Time passed, and just as I had predicted, he continued to spiral. No home, no money, no comfort. The spoiled, dependent husband who once thrived off my success was now a desperate man, bouncing from one job to another, struggling to keep himself afloat. And I moved on. I didn't feel sorry for him. Not for a second. In fact, every time I heard about another disaster in his life, a dark sense of satisfaction settled in my chest. It wasn't bitterness. It wasn't pettiness. It was justice. A well-earned reckoning for every lie, every betrayal, every moment I had wasted on him. And then, just when I thought the story couldn't get any better, the news came. Valerie filed for divorce. I found out through an acquaintance, one of the few people who still dared to speak to me after everything that had happened. She hesitated at first, as if unsure how I would react, then finally let the truth slip with a small, knowing smile. Valerie had left Daniel. And she wanted alimony. The laughter burst out of me before I could stop it. Loud, genuine, deep from my gut. The irony was too perfect, the full-circle justice too satisfying. Daniel had lost everything. And now, the woman he had destroyed our marriage for was about to take what little he had left. Daniel couldn't hold a steady job, and Valerie had no intention of supporting him. The irony was almost too perfect. The woman who had once sworn Daniel was her great love, the one who clung to him while I worked to keep a roof over our heads, had finally done to him exactly what he had done to me, left him the moment he was no longer useful. And now, she wanted alimony. The absurdity of it sent another wave of laughter through me. She claimed Daniel had promised to take care of her, that now, with a baby, she needed financial support. The very idea was too ridiculous to take seriously. But the best part? Daniel didn't even have the money to give her. He had lost everything: his home, his stability, his comfort. And now, even the woman he had betrayed me for was coming for whatever scraps he had left. Karma had come knocking, and this time, there was no one left for him to leech off. I had to see it for myself. The following week, I made sure to accidentally show up at a place I knew he still frequented, a rundown bar, one of the only places he could still afford. As I walked in, I spotted him immediately at the counter, slumped over his drink like a man who had finally accepted his fate. He was a shadow of who he used to be: thinner, dark circles heavy under his eyes, his beard unkempt, a cheap beer clutched in his hand. The confidence, the smugness, the entitlement, it had all been stripped away. I took my time, walking slowly, deliberately, and sat 2 seats away from him. The moment he noticed me, his face tightened, exhaustion and bitterness written all over him. He was tired. Of fighting, of losing, of himself. I didn't say a word at first, just picked up my drink and savored the moment. His voice was rough when he finally spoke, his words laced with resentment. He wanted to know if I was happy now, if seeing him like this brought me satisfaction. I took a slow sip and let the silence linger before answering. Yes, very. The disbelief in his eyes was almost comical. He had spent so long twisting the truth, making excuses, convincing himself that his choices had been justified. But now, faced with the wreckage of his own making, there was no one left to blame. He scoffed, shaking his head, trying to brush it off, but I wasn't done yet. He had thrown everything away: our marriage, our home, the life I had built for Valerie. And now? She had abandoned him just as easily as he had abandoned me. He tried to explain, claiming I didn't understand, that it wasn't that simple. But I understood perfectly. His great love had fallen apart the moment he had nothing to offer. He went quiet then, his gaze dropping to his empty glass, his fingers gripping it tightly. The truth stung. Valerie had told him outright. She couldn't be with someone who had nothing to offer. The same man who once believed I wasn't enough for him had finally been discarded for the exact same reason. The irony was too poetic. He had been nothing more than a convenience for her, just as I had been for him. And once he stopped being useful, she threw him away like garbage. There was nothing left for him to say. I stood, ready to leave, and as I turned to go, I made sure to leave him with one last thought, the best part of it all. He deserved every bit of this. And then I walked away, leaving him alone in his misery, drowning in the ruins of the life he had destroyed with his own hands. After that day, I severed every last tie to my past. I cut off my family, the aunts who kept preaching forgiveness, my mother who still insisted I had gone too far. I owed nothing to them, nothing to Daniel, nothing to the people who had stood by while I was betrayed. The only person I owed something to was myself. And so, I started over. I built a new life from scratch. Bought a new apartment, one that was truly mine. Sold everything that reminded me of that pathetic chapter of my life. Donated some things. Burned others. I erased Daniel and Valerie from existence. I went out more, met new people, enjoyed a life free from dead weight. For the first time in years, my life was truly mine. And while I thrived, Daniel kept sinking. Months later, I heard that he had tried to appeal the divorce ruling, attempting to argue that he deserved alimony. The judge had laughed in his face and denied him outright. Valerie, on the other hand, continued to drain whatever pitiful amount of money he had left. And me? I had never felt better. The world was exactly as it should be. I was free, and Daniel was getting exactly what he deserved. What a story! If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more. Share your thoughts below, and I'll see you in the next one.